once again, we're back, just having a short chat. Tonight is intended to be very, very relaxed, not uptight, and so I'm thankful to have Jordan here. And before I bring him on, I'm going to get Daryl to say hello. Hello, Daryl.
Hello, I'm glad you said that about being relaxed because I was real uptight, but I just relaxed and I'm good now.
You were a bit uptight, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I tell you, we have been so exhausted. I mean, an uncle that I so admired, he passed away, and tomorrow is his funeral. And one of our crew members, Rick, his family, they're out simply because tomorrow they have a funeral for his father-in-law, and you're going to be there, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
Yes, I will. I sure will.
Are you conducting the service?
No, um, I have the liberty to speak. I don't know. We'll see how it goes, but his pastor, he went to the First Baptist Church here, and he's going to be the one conducting. So seems like a really nice guy. I think he'll honor Kimberly's wishes. And so,
That sounds good. That sounds good. Jordan, welcome.
Hello. How you doing?
Doing marvelous, wonderful. Your Yeti microphone sounds great.
Good, good. I haven't actually gotten a whole lot of opportunities to use it just yet, so this is a good place to use it. Kind of what I intended it for, really. Um, but I just got it a few months ago, and I got compliments on it right away.
It's a very, very good mic. It's something that I brag about all the time. I think Daryl needs one. I think we all need one. But I don't know, getting close to a microphone is not what some of these guys around here want me to do. And so they have one over my head. It's a long shotgun mic. It's about, well, it's too long, but it is what it is. Let's talk about atheism and theism for a few minutes. Tonight, I asked the question, are atheists and theists building a Trump wall? And what I mean by that, are we creating division, that is, in the conversation? Or are we trying to give each other an ear? Are we moving forward in that? Are we building relationships? What are we doing? And so what say you, Jordan?
Well, it's something I've been taking steps to try to avoid, actually. Part of part of my attempts to build up relationships rather than, wall people out is take the time to um, listen to their perspectives more and interpret their positions as charitably as I can and um, find common ground with them. And I've been an atheist for several years, but in the recent months, I've started reattending the church that my family goes to, and I guess you could say part of that was the fact that for a while, I didn't feel like I needed a community, and then I gradually realized I had a need for that, and um, I find that there's still a lot of enough common ground with the Christians there um, that I've befriended them. I've started attending regularly again and going to church. I think even as a child, I wouldn't so much take the initiative to go to church, but now it's more like it's something I look forward to, and it's ironic that I look forward to it now as an atheist more than I did as a Christian.
Now, when you say you like it, what inspires you about attending these meetings?
I think the big draw for me is it's a community full of people, at least at my church, where they're interested in learning how to live well with other people. They're interested in being a moral person, increasing empathy. They they have this. They tend to be passionate about Jesus and the model that he gave them. They see him as a hero, and so their love of wisdom, I think, is what I resonate with. I too want to seek that out and preserve the wisdom that has been given to us and pass it on.
That's good. What have you heard lately about Jesus or any of the other characters in the Bible that you resonate with?
Well, just earlier this evening, actually, right after work, I went to a Bible study with some of my peers. And we were, even though we call it a Bible study, it's more a small group. Right now, we're beginning a small book called Speaking of Jesus. And it's about putting away this idea of evangelism and just living out the principles that people fell in love with in the first place about Jesus. Just being Jesus rather than just trying to spread the message. And that much I can appreciate because one of the things now that I like to ask of new theists when I meet them, or Christians in particular, is that if they claim to follow Jesus, what is it about Jesus that they fell in love with? What are the values that are made apparent in that? Because you can tell by what they consider, what stands out to them about Jesus, that is what matters to them. That's the values that we can talk about and find common ground in.
What is there about Jesus that so compels you?
Well, one of the points I brought up tonight was how the Jesus pointed out that despite the church having this in-group that they put their trust in, and then also this out-group that's beyond that in theory can't be trusted. Jesus said, actually, there are people in your in-group now, like the leaders of the church even, that actually don't deserve to be trusted. And yet there are outsiders that actually do deserve to be trusted. And so there's kind of a challenge to give outsiders a chance and to question the insiders. And it's kind of a shift of that idea. And I guess he challenged the traditional notions that kind of come as common sense to people, and he had some interesting insights into morality and whether he was a real person or not. Whoever wrote the story was aware of the moral insights that he gave. So I think he was right to put the focus, or really just even point out that we need to continuously bring our focus back to what ultimately matters to us. And that's almost what people are trying to do every Sunday morning when they go to church, is that they want to bring that focus back to what ultimately matters to them, and remember why. Remember the positive meaning that they they live for.
Right. Right. That's good. That's good. When we read the book of John, we find that this author, whether it be John or one of the aristocrats, we find Jesus in this conversation with Nicodemus, chapter 3. Chapter 3, verse 16 is probably one of the most popular passages in all of the New Testament. For God so loved the world, blah, blah, blah. In that conversation, do you find anything that you resonate with?
That particular conversation I haven't read in a while, so the details of it are not clear.
Let me open it up for a moment.
Yeah,
I'll
I was
read
going to pull that up myself.
just a couple of passages, a couple of verses. Now, in chapter 3, verse 1, I'm reading from the NIV to make it simple. Now, there was a man of the Pharisees named Nicodemus, a member of the Jewish ruling council. He came to Jesus at night and said, "Rabbi." And so, this was an interesting term that he would apply to Jesus because, Jesus wasn't making any he wasn't making claims, but here he's referred to as rabbi in the text. But he says, "We know you are a teacher who has come from God, for no one could perform the miraculous signs you are doing if God were not with him." I beg your pardon? Okay, Diana's here. Okay, that's the noise. Okay.
Hi, folks.
Hello.
I just got back home from a doctor's appointment. I just saw your message. Hope you don't mind my coming by anyway.
I didn't know what was happening. I thought Jack was in the back chewing gum and putting his mouth into the microphone. It would, and so, okay. What we're doing, we're exploring a bit of where Jordan is. Let me go back into the story. You've been an atheist for approximately 2 years. Is that correct?
Now it's actually been more like 5.
5, okay.
Yeah.
2 to 5. And now you find yourself actually going back to church, and some of these stories, some of the wisdom that we find in the Bible seems a bit attractive to you. Am I misinterpreting what you're saying?
No, yeah, I'm looking at it from a new perspective now, and for a while there, as is common among atheists, I looked at it perhaps from a more cynical, not just critical, but cynical perspective, and now I'm looking at it more charitably, and looking especially to find common ground with other people that believe in it. And as you brought up, I don't want to build up walls between theists and atheists. I want us to find common ground and remember what ultimately matters.
That's good. Well, let's back up a bit before we jump into the book of John in this narrative, because I've been talking for quite some time about atheism and theism have nothing, that is, nothing compelling, and I don't know if people are actually getting it. I was a theist for a long, long time. I do claim to be a multi-axial theist, and I tried to explain that the other day. I don't know whether I did an adequate job or not, but I attempted to do so. But when it comes to a position that is a philosophical position, my position is I suspended judgment. And the reason that I suspended judgment when it came to the question of God, I don't even find the questions to be competent. In other words, when we talk about existence, most theologians are not talking about God existing. If you ever hear a theologian stating that God exists, they are typically equivocating. In other words, what they're suggesting is the kind of existence that we're talking about concerning God would be completely out of the realm of what we get out of naturalism, that is, in ontology. And so that framework is completely, not even analogous to what most theologians are talking about. So I think for clarity, that is, for people who are not well read, it's simply better to state most of them do not believe that God exists. And that comes across very, very clear. In fact, most theologians actually lean toward, if there is a God, very skeptical. In other words, there is a lot of skeptical theologians. They lean in this direction that if there is a God, perhaps he created existence, and he created existence to evolve. And so the question of God existing would not be competent to the question of God, if that makes any sense. And so within the framework of existence, you would not find God, because you would not conflate God with what he created. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I think so. I've been trying to listen to newer perspectives, and for example, Stephen Hoyt, he's offered an interesting alternative understanding of what the nature of God is in the first place. Describing him as something metaphysical, not a concrete entity, but perhaps an abstract one, and that's interesting to think about. It's likewise. I've even started to suspect if maybe the authors of books in the Bible perhaps had the same perspective, where they thought of God as something that wasn't necessarily causally connected to us. It was something more abstract than that. Something that, when they describe God as being timeless, he literally is, as timeless as numbers or things like that.
There is a beautiful portion of the book of Psalms that I will at some point deal with from the standpoint of Hebrew, because it's as if time is discussed in this context. When we discuss beginning, we have a vanishing point. That is, if we try to go back to beginning, it's like it just disappears. And the same thing is true with end. And this is analogous in the poem, speaking about God in the context of a rhetorical device. And so it's not like this author is pushing, God, 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 we know what God is, or anything like that. It's very abstract. I think it's beautiful, excellent poetry. But let me go back to just a couple of my points, because I want to be clear. Lots of people are saying I'm very unclear about this, but I don't want to be. But when I look at theism and then I look at atheism, I see atheism, number one, as a broad-stroking position, because I don't know of any atheist who knows everything about theism, and yet most atheists claim that they're willing to broad-stroke all of theism with that little alpha privative. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, there are many that attach baggage to the terms. Yeah.
Right. So, it's kind of like if you're going to take a position, because atheism and theism both, if you're an atheist, if you're a theist, it means that you haven't suspended judgment. It simply means that when you've thought about the question, you have a viewpoint to the question, you've answered the question, you've stated your position about the question, or you've at least formed an opinion on the question. Would that be true?
Yeah. That's what I think both of the terms refer to, is someone has been presented with the question and they have a perspective. Right.
So it's a response to the question, whereas an agnostic, a pure agnostic, would be someone who says, if little Johnny and little Susie were sitting in an algebra class and they heard A plus B equals C, and the algebra teacher asked the question, what is A? If little Johnny started thinking and said, well, A is a goat, And then if little Susie spoke up, no, 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 A is not a goat. Would not the algebra teacher simply, excuse me, would not the algebra teacher simply say, well, we really don't have anything compelling. We don't have anything that would move us in that direction. However, A could be a goat or A may not be a goat. However, it's best to suspend judgment. Would not, if we were practicing the discipline of algebra, wouldn't it be better to simply suspend judgment than to form an opinion on A?
Yeah, sure. I think so.
Okay, so we have much more that would tell us something about A than we do God. And yet we're so willing to form an opinion on God or not God. And my question is, why? Why don't we simply suspend judgment and take neither position? That way we can resonate with story, we can resonate with wisdom, we can resonate with all kinds of things. We can come together and we can have common ground. But as long as this fight, this pissing contest in a sense, stays here, as if, people are not saying in atheism, I'm suspending judgment. People in atheism are simply saying, gods are bullshit. I hear that all the time. Every time that I go into an atheistic group, that's what they're saying. When I go into a theistic group, they're making claims, bold claims. Yes, God does exist. Yes, God does exist. And so my point is, that's like little Johnny and little Susie having this argument. Little Johnny is saying to the algebra teacher, yes, God, A is a goat. And little Susie is arguing, yes, A is not a goat. And so my question is, if little Susie and little Johnny started debating over A being goat and not goat, would that not look a little bit foolish?
It does in knowing the broader context that that's occurring in, yeah.
Yeah, and so when I hear people debating God, isn't that like little Johnny and little Susie being foolish? Isn't there some foolishness there? No one's competent to the question. We don't even have a methodology to even tease out what God would actually look at like. In other words, we're cartooning definitions. We just make stuff up. That's what we're doing. And if we're ever so honest, we need to admit to that. However, the thing that I appreciate about you, Jordan, is that you were willing to go and say, I love building community with people who are trying to find wisdom, models of behavior that I can identify with, I resonate with. And you've already told me, a little bit of this and that. I enjoyed it. That inspired me. I was blessed by that, if I can use a theological term. And so, is it best for us to become theist and atheist, or simply be people who say, I'm not willing to be either. I simply want to suspend judgment, because I don't think that we have enough on the table to suggest either way. I want to leave the door open.
I wish more could approach the topic with that kind of humility, but I think the extremes on the spectrum are each generating reactions on either end, and
but
that kind of fuels that foolish conversation.
But here's what's happening in the communities that we find online, on YouTube, etc. We find people taking a philosophical approach. Well, there's nothing in philosophy that would suggest that we have anything compelling. You can study epistemology until the cows come home, and there's nothing about epistemology that's going to improve your argument of God or not God. And so we can go out into the streets, we can do all kinds of things and practice deconversion and conversion techniques, but what makes us different than little Susie and little Johnny in my A plus B equals C analogy?
I think what makes us different is that we we understand that there's that broader context that is possible for the conversation. The fact that, as you presented in the analogy, it's take a step back and look at the fact that we have a whole formula that we're trying to consider here. A squared plus B squared equals C squared or something like that. That abstraction is more the point of the lesson. And it's something that can be applied in a whole number of situations. And that's the nature of abstraction, is stripping away the accidental properties. And so that's what I think we need to focus on, the process, not the conclusions.
I've heard that somewhere.
Yeah, me too.
I have no idea where you would have heard that.
Who said that? Doggone. Damn, Daryl.
Who said that? I've never heard that.
I'm committed to a process, not a conclusion. Maybe Jesus said that. We'll give it to him.
I wish people would say it.
Okay, if I'm committed to a process, not a conclusion, if I'm willing to say, I find a lot of value being committed to a process. This is why I'm trying to have show after show after show, and they may get real boring, and people may turn the channel. I get that. There are so many other programs on YouTube that are far more entertaining and interesting than this one, okay? So turn the channel. But here's my point. I think in this community here, what we're trying to do is simply ask a simple question. If we have nothing, that is nothing compelling either way, why have we formed an opinion on the question of God? When we know good and well we would not form an opinion on A and A plus B equals C, we're not going to form an opinion on that. We're disciplined as human beings enough to know that's immature to do. That is, when you have nothing, we simply leave it alone. We put it on the shelf. And so my point is, if we are to have disciplined theology at all, that that is a good approach, a sufficient approach to the question, this is going to take methodology. This is going to take some research. This is going to take opening the door a bit and exploring. And this means that people who are really curious about whether it's God or not God, these people would have to be committed to a process, not a conclusion or an opinion here, correct?
Right.
And so how can we explore the question of God if we've already formed the conclusion? I'm an atheist. I'm a theist.
What comes to mind for me is the fact that when I use the term atheist, when I self-identify with that, it pertains to a specific understanding of what the gods are. So, and of course, theists will do the same. They will have a particular understanding that they use for what it means to believe in a God. And and outside of that context, if you change what the meaning of God is, then that also would change what label would be appropriate for describing a particular person. So, for example, Steve Hoyt's understanding of God as metaphysical or an abstraction, that's an idea I'm willing to entertain. It no longer becomes a question of does God exist? It's rather, I guess that's not the kind of question you would ask under that understanding of what the gods are. So using the atheist term in that context wouldn't even matter.
If I'm watching a movie and I say, I watched the Beverly Hillbillies, and I said, I'm not a Clampett, and I started a movement saying I'm not a Clampett, that doesn't make sense to me. I feel as if I can watch the Beverly Hillbillies without saying I'm not a Clampett. I enjoy watching the Clampetts, and I think that we should enjoy watching humanity and where people find themselves. And if we can appreciate the acting or the stories of the Clampetts throughout their history, that is, in a fictitious, did you guys like the show, by the way? I mean, it's old. Come on,
I
Diana.
watched an episode last night, and it was the early ones, and they are funny. I still like it.
I mean, many people resonated with that show, but my point is, when we watch something, simply to say, I'm not that, that sometimes gets weird, that is, in my mind, because, when I don't know the Clampetts, I don't know this, these people writing these scripts and all of that, but there are bits and pieces of the Beverly Hillbillies that I really enjoy. And so sometimes I think that we say, let's throw the alpha privative out here, and I'm just going to refuse all God talk A to Z. I find this happening in the atheistic community, and this makes my heart hurt because this book that we call the Bible, it's rich in wisdom. It's rich in poetry. In fact, the majority, well, I should say a large portion of the Abjad is nothing but poetry. The largest portion of the Abjad is in metaphor. There's very little in it that's intended to be accurate. And that's one of the reasons that it's put into a consonant writing system. And so lots and lots of people are pushing back on the book of Genesis simply because they're ignorant, namely, of the facts, that is, the intent of why the people called the Jews actually put these books together. They put these books together to tease out, how can all of these tribes come together? They didn't need a determinate nomenclature, that is, for law, but they put it together poetically. They put it together in a manner that was an abjad. What does that mean? It means that they had a writing system without vowel points, and you could throw vowel points at it, and it was almost like a rendering abstract art. You could read into it. You could get what you wanted out of it. And so when you have 12 different tribes with 12 different ideas about what needs to be going on within the household of Israel, if you had law constructed like we have here in the United States, it probably would not have worked back then. So they thought that a poetic approach toward law, that is, toward Torah, was better for them in that day. Would that make any sense or not?
Yeah, that does. I knew that the Torah was meant to serve as a codification of the way that they were trying to live together as community, but a poetic approach to law, that's interesting, I guess.
This book right here,
It's not
that I
something
hold
I
in
would
my hand.
necessarily go toward.
If anyone wants to go with me, I'll go with you. You can simply come with me, and we can go and we can do the chants and all of that. Simply because when you go and you start reading the book, you start at the back, by the way, and then you're going to read from right to left. And when you read this, it's beautiful because it's chant. It's music to the ears of the people there. It's not about doctrine and dogma. It's about resonating. In other words, when I hear Johnny Cash, yes, Johnny Cash, when I hear him sing, and I've become a great fan of Johnny Cash. And years ago, I didn't like him, but when I started listening to a lot of his music, this guy, he's really challenging the people of his day. And I wasn't aware of that because I never paid attention to Johnny Cash at all because I was into jazz and rock and the blues. That was my kind of music. I didn't want to get that involved in country, but I don't know, Johnny Cash had a lot to say, and so I missed out on that. And I think a lot of people are missing out on how different cultures do X, Y, and Z. But when you study this Abjad, it's beautiful. It has the good and the bad and the ugly in it. And to me, that's the thing that I love. When people say, oh, there are a lot of contradictions there, the people who say that can never articulate their arguments well enough to even indicate the contradictions, simply because the intention of this book is to demonstrate the diversity of people within 12 different tribes. So you have various views of God. You have various views of the prophets. You have various views of even Moses throughout the Torah, throughout the writings, throughout the prophets. Most people are not aware of that. And when the New Testament came along, what took place, and this is the problem in translation theory, and I keep saying that the New Testament is a failed meta-language because it was built upon the premise that the gloss system of the Old, that is the Old Testament, what the Protestants and the Catholics call the Old Testament. The Jews do not refer to their writings as the Old Testament. They simply call it what it is, Torah, writings, and prophets. And so, if I can explain it in this way, what Christians did, they did this. They took and said, that has to have a determinate nomenclature. They said, I'm talking about Christians, they said, Christian scholars said, let's apply a determinate nomenclature to an abjad. Why? Why take something so poetic and apply something so determinate? That was a transgression of linguistics, A to Z. Any linguist will tell you, you don't do that. That's crazy. But Christianity, I mean, those Christian scholars got away from it. Why did they do that? They did this to build a church, not an ecclesia, as Jesus talks about. This is why I'm very pro-Jesus, because this guy, he would have been as pissed with the Christians as he was with the Mosaic stone throwers. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, exactly. I think that the common understanding of the message, both the first and second testaments, is that it's almost like the common understanding is just a parody of what was originally meant. And it takes a lot of study to recognize that it's not what it seems. And I guess there is a question I do want to run by you.
Sure.
About this idea of atheists and theists coming together. This idea of expanding our circle of empathy. I think you might have used that term before.
Sure.
It's kind of the nature of things where when you take away that idea of againstness, when you try to look for common ground, however much you form a common identity with someone, you are likewise defining what you're not. So, that's I guess you could say that's even the nature of set theory is whatever you define something to be, you're also defining what it isn't. And that means inevitably, I guess, someone gets excluded from that because there are going to be values and beliefs that someone out there will not agree with. So whatever baseline we form, even if we were reaching for the lowest common denominator, somebody's going to be outside of that. And
Sure.
I wanted to know what you thought of that.
I'd like to do a show on it. I tell you what, would you come back and let's do a show on that?
Absolutely.
Because it's the way that you win a debate is to ask the other guy a question that requires about 4 hours of answer when you only have 30 minutes.
I like it.
Okay, and so you asked me a question that I can't answer in 5 to 10 minutes. You asked me a question that I would have to do several lectures on, and it's worth focusing in on that alone for at least an hour and a half or so. And so I think it would destroy the premise of this show if we went there, but it's a very, very good question. I'd
Yeah,
love
if you're willing to entertain that with an answer, then I'm willing to wait for however long it takes.
Oh, yeah, we can get into that because that, it would be nice just to dismiss this show and let's say go for it. But for time's sake,
Yeah, we can stick with the topic.
let's go ahead and stick with the topic here tonight, but let's get into that soon. Make sure that you private message me because that's going to be fun, probably interesting for our people. Let's go back to this wall in the context of atheist over here and the theist over here, and this is what I keep suggesting. You have little Johnny and you have little Susie, and they're fighting. They're building this wall, and the algebra teacher is saying, I really don't need students in my classroom clashing over goat and not goat. This doesn't make sense. Little Johnny, settle down. Little Susie, settle down. You need to understand the process of algebra. We may never know what A is. And some people, I think they are obsessed. They feel as if, no. We have to know right now. I need an answer. And the great thing about learning algebra for the first time is you realize that some of these expressions, you'll never know what A is or B or whatever. You can put together various things that demonstrate this. But my point is, we have much less than what A is in the context in which I'm speaking about A plus B equals C than we do about God. And my question is, why do we keep finding people? And I found myself forming an opinion. And then I woke up one day and I said, I guess I finally woke up. Why did I form an opinion on a question that I'm not competent to? Why did I develop a viewpoint toward a question that I should have suspended judgment on? And that bothered me because I'm very committed to process. I'm very committed to discipline. And it doesn't make any sense in any kind of science to do that. It seems like the narrative of becoming an atheist or a theist, that is almost like walking away from all philosophical arguments, or that is the discipline of all sciences and philosophy. Would you agree with that?
I do. I mean, I've noticed, I grew up Roman Catholic.
You don't even act like an atheist any longer. What's wrong with you? What's going on? I mean, you were a theist, then an atheist, and now you're saying, I give up. What's going on? The walls are coming down.
My, but when I used to go to church on Sunday mornings, you didn't hear Ecclesiastes very often. You didn't hear the book of Ruth very often. You didn't, I mean, now that Purim is upon us, you didn't hear the book of Esther. You heard what related to what the people at the front of the church wanted you to do, and whatever passages they thought related to that. So when you're talking about A being a goat or a not goat, I'm thinking that a lot of theists aren't so much worried about what God is or isn't, but what they want God to enforce over everyone. And I'm thinking that a lot of atheists are pushing back on that to an extreme, with we don't necessarily agree that this should be the way everyone behaves, especially when it hurts other people. So we're going to throw God out along with what you want God to do. God seems to be the basketball in this, getting tossed back and forth, when perhaps we should be focusing on what supposedly this God wants you to do or to not do, or more accurately, what the person speaking for God thinks you should be doing or not doing. Do I make sense there?
Sure. One of the things that I would like to say, I think Jordan made some fantastic points early on in the show. If you haven't watched it, go back and watch it.
Oh, I will.
Simply because what he did, and I'm impressed with this, he started out by saying, here's where I am, and now this is where I'm going, and I'm going there for community. And he's resonating with story. He's resonating with the wisdom that came from ancients. And yes, I'm talking about out of a book called the Bible. It's a collection of books. When you study the details, that is, if you get into the scientific approaches toward the text, that is, if you deal with higher and lower forms of textual criticism, you get to know a little bit about those ancients. And you also realize that you can't know, because we've lost much of the indexical and deictic elements that I keep talking about. This is why analysis can't be done. But yet at the same time, we can take a movie that's just made up, and we can take characters out of that movie, and we can resonate with X, Y, and Z that they did. Not that it's a real character, but it makes sense to us in a moral sense. And what I heard from Jordan, and you please correct me if I'm wrong, I heard Jordan state what I hear from most people who go to church. Most people who go to church, they sense something that they can't explain. And when they go to church, they hear stories, and they tend to conflate the story with what they have sensed. Now, the pastor will tell them that's God. And these people are not interested in argument, but they just feel good. They feel comforted. In other words, when my uncle died just a few days ago, lots of theists are in my family, but not theist in a philosophical sense, because I've never heard any of them make the claim that philosophers do when it comes to the term theist. But I hear these people saying stuff like this. Oh, he's better off today. He's no longer suffering. He's with grandma and grandpa and his sister and so on. You know, this is what they're saying. They're saying things that make themselves feel better. And I don't know why there is anything wrong with my grandson having a teddy bear. Sometimes that's comforting. Now, I can go up to my grandson and say, hey, that teddy bear, that's not real. And I can jerk that teddy bear away from my grandson, and he's going to cry. But isn't it true in life that everything that comforts us as human beings, it doesn't come from what we understand empirically. Sometimes we have to reach outside of that. Sometimes a song, we resonate with a song. Sometimes we resonate with a Star Trek movie, something that's gone way beyond what will ever be called fact. But we just resonate with it. It inspires us to get involved in science. Am I making any sense, or am I just babbling, rambling?
Yeah, oh, you're quite a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Go, Jordan.
I think I've also been reading Richard Carrier's books about the historicity of Jesus. And I think, I don't remember exactly how I phrased it. I think it actually happened to have that moral truth resonate with me.
Now, Manang, he was the guy who said that sometimes it's best psychologically to create fiction that, in a sense, runs parallel to our reality. And what he was talking about, he said, you know, the manner in which the brain works, what we sense we have faith in, and what we have faith in, when we have sensed it, we interpret that. And as we go through life, we are constantly constructing and reconstructing models of those things in the past and our present, and we're readjusting. And he said that a lot of that is fiction, and he said that's fine. You can take these children who went through this horrific, it's a tragic thing that took place in Parkland, Florida. Some psychologists were speaking a few days ago, and they said typically what happens when people see an event like this, they will say, you know, I thought it was fake. Many of these kids were saying, oh, it seems so fake. I didn't think that anything bad was happening. And it took time for them to accept oh, this really took place. And many of the kids were actually telling one story, and some of the psychologists were saying, well, let's not put all of our cookies in one basket here, because they may change their mind about the facts in time after they process that. And so we have to take time to process tragedy. We have to take time to process all of this. And guess what? All people don't use the same hermeneutic between this ear and that ear. In other words, we use different hermeneutics, different methods of interpreting things. Hence, we're going to have different outcomes. And so when we get involved in the great debate, we typically want to make sure that everything is so rational. Everything's got to be rational, and we're for the age of reason, and we're not about all this storytelling. But the facts are, within our brains, we have this mental lexicon, and our brain is constantly talking to whom? People around us. We talk more to ourselves, and we tell ourselves more stories than anyone else. And so not everything that we're telling ourselves is true, or the gospel, or scientifically modeled. Does that make any sense? And I just completely suspend judgment when you don't have anything. That's the mature thing to do.
Quick interjection. Hey, Jack, Dr. Jones is starting to break up a bit. Is it my end or is it your end?
It's clear here. It must be on your end. Did I not make sense?
I was having a hard time picking some of it up. You're very clear now.
Okay.
So maybe it was me.
It was breaking up. No, it was breaking up on my end too.
That was Google.
it was just the output. I think that was a bit.
Okay. Sometimes Google does weird things, but I guess my point is, I'm having a hard time. I really am struggling with why so many people have committed themselves to a position without having anything. And I'm not just talking about theists, I'm talking about atheists. Why have we jumped off the cliff? We don't have anything to catch us. There's nothing there. There's nothing there that would suggest theism or atheism. Why don't we suspend judgment and not jump off the cliff?
A lot of it's political expediency. There's a lot going on with rights being trampled on, humans not being treated very well because they seem to be an outgroup. And, okay, I can see atheism being an extreme reaction to that, trying to kick the feet out from under some of the people that are doing what they are doing by kicking God out from under them because God is the basis of their authority. Now, that's not necessarily the right thing to do because it's the way these people are using the God rather than the God itself. Do we need to try to get people to learn a different way of using the texts? I think that question was more or less rhetorical, but I think we do need to get people to
if you put the Bible,
read the text differently.
Right. I think if you put the Bible back in the classroom, and if you took scientific methodology toward the biblical text like theologians do and linguists and other people of that kind, what we would have is a completely different outcome. And so when people want to talk about story and all of that, and I really don't think that most atheists are pushing back on anything more than fundamentalism, if that makes any sense. But I see as many fundamentalists.
Makes all the sense in the world.
Yeah, I think I see as many fundamentalists in atheism today as I see in theism. And so I guess lots of red flags are going up my flagpole. And my question is, why can't we back up a little bit and say those are two isms that are not compatible? They're not going to get along. And so why can't we back up and suspend judgment and demonstrate a bit of maturity? We don't have anything, guys.
I found myself rejecting or I found in hindsight that I think I was rejecting the authoritarianism that I saw in
Sure.
The theistic community, and likewise, I realized I was also rejecting any of it that I saw among atheists as well, and the fact that it's that's I think something that many of us can agree on is the fact that there are authoritarian traits that we do not find attractive.
Right. See, you're now going to church studying, let's say, a book that would be considered by fundamentalists as extra biblical. That's a no-no, Jordan. But you're reading it anyhow, and you have other people in church who are willing to say, we're not fundies. We can read this book. And we have a progressive message. In other words, this Jesus that we're talking about doesn't have to be exact. It doesn't have to be a scientific representation. This is just story. And this is what poets do at a poets convention. I asked Aaron Ra when he was here, I said, yeah, if you went in and said what you did and tried to push back on things like you're pushing back in the context of the Old Testament, I said that would remind me of, you going to a poets convention expecting a determinate nomenclature. It doesn't make sense. And so, his pushback is against the book of Genesis and all of that, but yet he doesn't understand the book of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and the rest that follows, simply because this isn't written in a context that supports fundamentalism. This is written poetically. In other words, when I pick up this book, let me read this. Bereshith bara Elohim. Now, when I read that, one of the things that it gives me an instant clue about, okay, we're reading first and second temple Hebrew. It's a mix here. Now, listen to this. Bereshith. Bereshith is actually adverbial. It's actually this prepositional phrase. And when Jews read this, look at this. Just see this. This is real simple. Do you see this word right here? That's Bereshith. Now, for English readers over here, they'll read the word Genesis. Well, Bereshith is actually a prepositional phrase, and it's adverbial. But Jews simply do this. Well, they did this, I should say. They would simply name a book by the first word used. And here's why you can tell that this is metaphorical. Bara. If you'll parse this, look at all the morphological aspects of the word, we're going to find out that bara is not in agreement with Elohim. Elohim is in the plural. Bara, the verb, is in the singular. So what happens in English when someone has a plural subject and a singular verb? We're going to say those people really don't know how to conjugate, correct? Is that true, Dinah?
It could be that, or is there some reason that they deliberately did that?
There is a reason in Hebrew. The reason that you say, use the word Elohim with bara, it's to indicate what you're getting ready to look at is to be understood metaphorically. It's not to be taken literally. So don't think that this is an accurate representation. So they start their law out with what? Metaphor. Why? They want people to get along. One of the things that we're failing to see in America, we're so much about legislating character, and doggone, I'm a father, and I've learned that you can't legislate your children to do right. You've got to nurture that.
Amen.
The Jews had to nurture one another, and they used poetic expressions of nurturing one another. They were not trying to push shit down into people like trying to indoctrinate them. They wrote in abjad form because they loved one another. And I don't get why people are saying, well, I'm going to prove that the book of Genesis has all of these contradictions. If anyone knows anything about First and Second Temple Hebrew and can read this, they will find this to be amazing. It's nurturing. It's about having the ability to look at it this way and that way. It's like me dealing with my children. Okay, you don't get it? Well, I'm dad. I see it from this point of view. You see it from that point of view. But son, I'm not going to look down on you. I'm going to look across to you. So these people are trying to look across to each other instead of speaking down to one another. And this is why they write things poetically. They're trying to get along. They're trying to build social construct without being so legalistic. Does that make any sense to anybody but me?
Absolutely. Back to the thing I said, was it on Sunday that my Dr. Ed told me years ago? I forget where he was from, somewhere in Eastern Europe. He had said to me, you Americans are a lawless people. That is why you have so many laws. And we are, as Americans, very, very concerned with legislating behavior. It's not the fundamental feeling for each other that we're caring about. And that's got to change.
Sure. I mean, Jordan comes on the show and he starts talking about Jesus in a context that would resonate with most people his age. And Jordan, am I wrong? Are you not one who wants to nurture people? And the turnoff to you in theism was you had all of these fundamentalists. And so you turned to atheism, not because you wanted to take a position on the question, but atheism was simply a rejection of fundamentalism, was it not?
My peers at my church are very much rejecting the same fundamentalism and authoritarianism
Sure.
that I rejected. I came back and realized that they were feeling the same way, and they're coming at it with much more humility and with the understanding that it's not that we need to legislate people to be good. We have to just live out being good and let the beauty of that inspire people.
That's awesome.
Where do you go to church, Jordan? I'd like to sit in on one of those services.
I mean, he's going to tear me up, and he's preaching. I mean, this is good stuff, Daryl.
Yeah, it reminds me of what is supposed to be at the core of church Christianity, if you will. Supposedly we have this thing called the Holy Spirit, and he indwells us and empowers us to be kind and gentle and forgiving and patient and things like this. But that doesn't sound like law. As a matter of fact, the writer goes on to say, against these things there is no law. So what are we trying to accomplish would be the question. What are we looking for?
It reminds me of something Penn Jillette said, quite famously, I think, in that, well, this is only part of the quote, but he said, I've killed and assaulted and raped as many people as I wanted to, and that number is 0. And I don't want to hurt people. I want to live well with them. And when you get to that point, the law is not as necessary.
Right.
Fundamentalists want you to believe that everything in life is about God. Fundamentalists want us to believe that everything is through Christ. Most of the people that I have found in church are not all about God and Jesus. They have wonderful lives. They have lives that they actually say they built themselves. It's about them. They can take credit for things. Now, in fundamentalism, you can't take credit for anything because you have to give all glory, all praise to Sky Daddy. And I get why atheists call God Sky Daddy. I get that. That's funny. And the flying spaghetti monster. But at the end of the day, if there is, let's say, a God, not a God that exists, but a God, and if this God outside of existence actually created existence and actually created existence to evolve, think about this. If I don't believe in gravity, that really has nothing to do with whether gravity is working for me or not. Is that true?
Yeah, you don't believe in gravity, just try jumping off a cliff and see what happens.
Sure. So I don't have to live out my life believing in gravity for gravity to work for me, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Bingo.
Isn't the same thing true if there is a God who created existence, who's outside of existence, who may not be entangled with all of our messes? This God may be getting a buzz off of how things go in evolution, just letting things happen. I don't know. There may not be a God. I don't know. I have nothing compelling, so I've suspended judgment. But what if there is a God? In other words, an algebra teacher will say, Johnny, you may be right, little Susie, you may be right. I'm not going to disparage either one of you. Isn't that wonderful? There's a bit of humility to that. There's a bit of kindness to that. There's a gentleness to that that's sweet to me, in that you're willing to say, little Johnny, you could be right. Little Susie, you may be right, but both of you guys may be wrong. Now, when it comes to the question of God, is God or not God? Now, the question of God exists. There could be a multitude of possibilities. But my point is, we know nothing. We have nothing. We have formed an opinion on something that we're not competent to, and I don't get why. And so when I listen to Jordan, you don't sound like an atheist. You seem like a person who was frustrated with a certain mindset, and you backed away from it.
I'm a scientist, yeah. And I rejected this idea that revision and improvement are not possible with something like the Bible. And I was even engaging with an apologist yesterday, and I tweeted back to him, I'll give context for this, but I said, while the church's resistance to change is useful for protecting its culture from corruption, it likewise protects the church from correction. And that's the beauty I find in scientific methods, is that they are open to revision. And I want to see more of that in the church, because that comes from a place of humility where we acknowledge that we could be wrong.
Sure.
And of course, the context in which I was saying that was with regard to the church's attitude on an interpretation of what the Bible says about homosexuality. And I said, what if the church interpretation was mistaken? What if there wasn't actually a prohibition against this or something? What if it was actually prohibiting something else? And so that was the question I was putting forward to an apologist yesterday.
Well, you might cite Ann Nyland. She's probably one of the best lexical theorists in the world who doesn't have a dog in the fight when it comes to theology. She's very much agnostic, but she did a work, I think it was in 2005, released a version of the New Testament, and has a very articulate argument suggesting that these ancient writers, both in the Abjad form and also in the Greek form, these people were not disparaging homosexuals or anything like that, and puts together a framework that I think that most church people need to look at, and most theologians who really know their stuff are aware of that. And so that's really not where theologians are, but it's where quite a few pastors unfortunately find themselves. And so there's a big difference between pushing back on uninformed people and people in the know.
That's a good point. What was her name again?
Ann Nyland. Ann Nyland. Look up Ann Nyland. She has a New Testament. You can read any of the passages that concern you, like in Romans 1. That passage will lead you to many of the things that she states, has stated. John Lee is one of the world's leading lexical theorists, pushing back on Bauer, Art Gingrich, and all of those people who put out, let me see, I've got a lexicon up here.
How do you spell her name?
Nyland, Nyland. Okay, this is getting ready to be replaced. This is by Dr. Walter Bauer, and Dr. John Lee is pushing back on not just one entry, but all of the entries in this book. Now, this is considered to be the best on the market of lexicons. And people would say, I don't get it. What is that going to do to Christianity? It's going to do a lot. In the next 10 to 15 years, we're going to see a completely different paradigm shift. Dr. Daniel Wallace, he's very much a scholar. His colleague, Harris, Dr. Harris, he stated any work that was written 50 years ago or before that should be used as doorstops. And he's talking about any lexicon. This is why he's saying, take your Strong's Concordance, take your Thayer's, take all of these books and simply use them as doorstops, simply because we have found thousands upon thousands of fragments, thousands of manuscripts, both biblical and extra-biblical. And what that has done, it has given us a framework to work with to produce a koine-to-koine model lexically. And what it's doing, because Dr. Bauer, who is whose work, which is the premise of this book, which all translators have modeled their text from, his methods have been falsified. And that's big in science. If you're into science, this will be interesting. If not, you'll probably put it to the side and ignore it. Now, it takes time for change. By the time that lexical theory is shifted and translation theory is remodeled in Koine, it will take time to get to the marketplace before better translation models appear. Now, there's going to be a huge shift simply because of the manner in which people have approached, that is, lexical theory. Because back in the day, they used Holy Ghost Greek, and Bauer came along with an idea of trying to use linguistics in a method, but his method has been falsified. And so this is really, really up in the air. Does that help anybody?
You mentioned Holy Ghost Greek.
Holy Ghost Greek.
What the hell was that?
Sharabakudramashanda. Okay, seriously speaking, there was a time in which, before theologians started looking at the text, in other words, if you study John Calvin, if you study people like Martin Luther, and in fact, one of the things that I would challenge people to do, if you're really compelled that Christianity is telling you the truth all the time, Martin Luther, a very well-respected person within the Catholic Church, protested the Catholic Church, nailed a thesis on the doors. The last book that he wrote was The Jews and Their Lies, and that book was the premise for much of Hitler's mindset toward the Jews. If you read this book, Martin Luther gives a prescription of how to kill Jews. It's sick. You can't find it in any Bible bookstore, but you're going to find the works of Luther that were written before that. But by the time that he gave the conclusion of his writings in that book, The Jews and Their Lies, that's when people understood that this Luther, theologian Luther, Martin Luther, this guy was crazy, and he was. And so, but it represented Roman Catholicism to a T. Many people are not aware of Roman Catholicism being so anti-Semitic, but it was. I don't know if you guys are into
research. That one I know.
Okay.
They didn't even start trying to correct that until about 1965.
Right. Now, please understand that a lot of these people were using an approach. In other words, there's something called theologically driving the text, and that means that you interpret the text within the text and you allow the text to interpret itself. And there's a rule that theologians used to use, and it was called the law of first mention. Anytime that a word was used, you would use that word the same way over and over again. And this is very failed. Translators used to, back in the Holy Ghost Greek days, and the reason I call it Holy Ghost Greek, they would pray for inspiration, and their inspiration would come like that. But basically what they were doing, they would take one word and they would say, oh, this word means this. And every time they would find that word, even though it might be inflected differently, even used differently, they would insert the same English gloss. I mean, think about that. That's like saying, you know, I have a run right here on my hose. Now, a run on my hose, or my wife's hose, I don't wear pantyhose, by the way, but my wife does. If she has a run on her hose, or if we have a run on Wall Street, those are not the same kind of runs. Now, back before I hurt both of my my heels, you know, I would run 6, 7, 8, sometimes 9, 10 miles a day. I love running. My doctor told me to quit running, just walk. That's hard to do, but I get in at least 6 to 7 miles still today, but not running, but walking. But my point is, run can be used in many different ways. The same thing is true with up. But what they did in the text, and this is found in most of your early English translations, they would simply find a gloss that was fixed in the Old Testament, and they would carry that over into the Greek, and they would use that for their gloss system. So what we have in most English / Greek lexicons is actually a work that was borrowed out of Hebrew, out of a Hebrew / English gloss system. So it was completely failed. And this is why I don't like Richard Carrier's work, simply because he's still using a failed meta-language. Does that make sense? In other words, if you're still using something that's been falsified and you're trying to make all of your arguments, he's a brilliant person if he's dealing with history outside of the biblical text, but he keeps using all the wrong tools. He's going to the wrong works and all that. That's why I really, I don't care for his work when it comes to, speaking about Jesus, but I appreciate some of his points, and I don't want to disparage the person. I think he's a very kind person.
Okay, that sort of interpretation is going to run you into some major problems then. If you run into a word which is like the English word cleave, which is its own antonym.
Sure. Yeah. And so I don't know if this show has been useful for anyone, but it seems like atheists and theists, they kind of remind me of Donald Trump. They're trying to build this wall because, they don't want the Mexicans over here associating with the Mexicans over here. I'm just using it in a context that would be funny. Perhaps that's not funny. I grew up with so many Hispanics in my life. I love Hispanics. I love them so very much, and it's unfortunate that we have so many people disparaging Hispanics, people who want to migrate from this place to the next, simply trying to wall people out, trying to legislate morality and all of that. There's something about that doesn't make sense to me. And so when it comes to the great debate, it doesn't make sense to me. And so you guys give me something to go home on that would inspire me. Go for it, Jordan.
I think I've already seen the benefit of joining community and trying to break walls down rather than build them up. I think up until I had that community, I didn't realize just how short-sighted I was, how self-centered I was. And even those who advocate for, the selflessness that, the gospel would promote, they can say they believe in those things and yet act in such selfish ways. And likewise, maybe they're taking for granted the value of loyalty. And not just loyalty to people, but loyalty to principles. And that's something about authoritarianism that I despise, is contradictions like that between what we say and what we do, and the inability to accept revision or correction. As a scientist, it's the most unattractive thing I can see in a person, and that's why I've gravitated toward the people at my church. It's because I'm seeing a humility there that resonates with me, and those are the kind of people that I have hope in. That they're looking for the same thing I am. They're looking to come together, not divide people apart.
Wow, that's good. That's good. Daryl.
Before I make my inspirational statement, I have a question for Jordan.
Sure.
Do the people that you congregate with, do they know that you're an atheist?
Yes, they do, and I've told them about my, I guess you could say, testimony that led up to why I joined them again, and so they know my perspective on the matter now.
That's amazing, and to me that's key, because when I think of I think a lot about what churches are. They're everywhere, and lots of people go to them, and I've thought there's so much of what people get there that they don't need, and how do we change that? Do we empty out the church buildings, or do we change the structure of what goes on in the four walls? And I think what you're experiencing is a very good glimpse of what should be happening within the four walls. I witnessed something, one of the most powerful things I've seen in my life, to be quite honest about it. At the time, my mom was in her 80s. She is now beginning to fade a little bit mentally, but at the time she was very clear-headed. And she began to speak out and express thoughts that had probably been suppressed for most of her life, all of her life, actually. Her true belief, what she really believed. And even as she said these things, I think she probably still has a little fear of, at the very best, some sort of a shunning, people rejecting her because of these deep inner thoughts that she had. But to the contrary, she found that she was embraced, and no one had a problem with even the things that she shared. As a matter of fact, there was more agreement than she'd expected. But this, to me, is the problem that we have built, especially into our churches. For the most part, that's not allowed, and it's certainly not welcomed. But until we get to the place where we can gather and people can be free to express their beliefs or their disbeliefs without even fear of being judged or reprimanded or ostracized as a result, then we can never build the kind of relationships that we need to build true community. And so if we can, I commend your church, what's going on there. And I think if we can see more of that, I think that church can become more beneficial than detrimental, as I think in many ways it has been.
Diana, what's your final word?
Well, I very much appreciate the community that can be found in a church. Heck, I might still be a churchgoer where the UU church I was attending about 10 years ago, not as cliquish as it was. This is where I'm thinking that perhaps those within churches should focus a little bit more about the people next to them in the pews than they do on what the guy up front is telling them to like or not like or do or not do. This is a world inhabited by humans. We've got to get along. And forcing people into the margins isn't going to do it. We really need to find that fundamental community, that oneness as a species. And the way the texts are being used, I don't see that happening. Something has to change. I'd like to see it change. I hope it can in my lifetime.
That would be good. I think that we can change things for the better. But, I keep saying this, if we're going to close our eyes and say, hey, listen, I hear the question when it comes to God. I'm going to take a position over here without having anything, or I'm going to take a position over there without having anything. I don't know that doing that is going to bring community. I think that when people are willing to back up a bit and admit things like, I just don't know, I don't have anything. It reminds me of what politicians do. They seem so confident. They seem like they know everything. But there's something about what happens between two people when they are honest enough to say, I don't know. It breaks the ice a bit. And not being so Gnostic, not being so certain. And to me, I think that would be a much better pathway for all of us. But those are just my thoughts. And so with that said, we're out of here. Good night.